The Last Disciples. The shadow-like coloring expanded up Dacheldor's neck to the base of his skull and spread down from his waist until it was halfway down his legs. As it did, he felt his physical needs fading. The power from his core sustained him completely, relieving all need for anything else. He found himself feeling less like a man. The minds of his disciples no longer felt like separate entities to him. His personality was a fusion of them all as one. The only time he felt them differently was when they chose to connect to him. Otherwise, he was aware and living there every moment, but it was more like something happening in the background of his mind. He could process existence in an entirely new way, and even registered the flow of time differently. He no longer thought of himself as Dacheldor. Dacheldor was the name of the clone who was living out his old life. He was Dacheldor. He was more than his old self. Still, a part of him felt attached to the mortal world. He felt a need to document who he was, who his disciples were, and how he felt before it all slipped away. There was no telling if he would still desire this in a few years. He sought an individual who would make the perfect scribe, not someone with powers and superhuman abilities, just a man who was good at taking what was in his head and putting it on paper. He found such a man and offered him the opportunity to become one of his disciples. The man agreed and later took on the name Nexus. This name represented his role to Dacheldor. He was the central source that all of the information about the past of every disciple, and Dacheldor himself, would flow to. When Nexus slept, he dreamed their pasts, and when he woke, he wrote. It is from the notes of Nexus and various memoirs written by Dacheldor, the history of Dacheldor was fully conceived. Nexus journeyed to the worlds of the disciples' pasts. He met and interviewed interesting people. He became an adventurer in his own right. Eventually, Nexus even picked up the path of the Mage Lord, becoming another of Dacheldor's eyes and ears within their ranks. On his travels, Nexus met an interesting deity named Metzli. She was a nature goddess who healed the sick, but on nights of the full moon she turned into a vicious beast. Nexus became infatuated with her and offered to write her story. As she grew to know Nexus, Metzli became aware of what he was and asked to become a disciple as well. Though Dacheldor would not have considered the wild and sassy deity initially, Nexus's love for her was enough to sway him. She became Dacheldor's disciple and another pair of eyes and ears for him amongst the deities. During this time, Bylon took on more disciples as well. He also decided to create a clone of himself, named Benji, who would accompany the clone of Darkfire as his brother. Benji was also a disciple of Bylon under the same stipulation Dacheldor had placed on Dacheldor. Bylon and Dacheldor grew to love each other's company, as each became more accustomed to being an Illithal and less accustomed to being a man. They found each other to be the only beings capable of truly understanding them. Even the disciples, when not in true union with them, could not grasp what they were experiencing. Bylon helped Dacheldor seek more Illithal and greatly improved the speed at which he uncovered them. Dacheldor devoured dozens of them over a rather short time, holding on to their energy until he found worthy successors. Bylon and Dacheldor worked together to try to select who would become the future Illithal, and began training them in hopes that some would reach a point where the energy could be transferred to them successfully. When the shadow-like coloring expanded to fully cover Dacheldor's legs and feet, Bylon began seeing gold coloring overtake his back. He was undergoing the same changes. The shadow-like coloring also consumed the back of Dacheldor's head, leaving what appeared to be only a face, like a mask, remaining. Dacheldor, Benji, and Darkfire lived out their lives in the way they always had, eventually meeting in Limbo. By that time, Dacheldor had spent many years with Daisy, raising their son Derek, before going their own ways. He had also raised Nicole until she went off on her own. It was then that Dacheldor appeared to them both. Derek did not know what to make of Dacheldor at first, but he was quickly convinced to become a disciple. Dacheldor spun tales of the angel Derek had become in previous timelines and offered to give those memories and abilities back to him. Derek could not resist. Nicole also accepted becoming a disciple, but for her own reasons. She had always longed to truly understand her father. This was the chance she had been waiting for. As both became disciples, Dacheldor was filled with relief. His children were saved, and would always be with him. He now had 13 disciples: Akasha, Kara, Dacheldor, Daramal, Derek, Doomsday, Gas, Inquisitor Sin, Metzli, Nexus, Nicole, Shakarok, and Xenos. He knew of only one more being he would want to turn into a disciple: Nicole and Shakarok's yet-to-be-born child, Seth. Nicole opposed this idea. While she agreed that she wanted to use Shakarok's genetics to recreate their future son, she did not want her son to become a disciple. She reasoned that taking on more than one generation as disciples from the same family would risk the desire to constantly do so throughout eternity. To Dacheldor's surprise, the other disciples all agreed. He decided these 13 would be the only disciples he would ever have. Nicole and Shakarok still planned to give birth to Seth with Bylon's help, even though Shakarok was now in a very long relationship with Vala. When Seth grew to become a Realm Lord, as he had in other timelines, he would be turned into an aberration and regain his memories of his original timeline. As such, he would not be lost if time was ever changed, and this would be good enough. He would be free to become his own being. Dacheldor contemplated another possibility. If Seth was able to grow powerful enough, he may be able to turn him into an Illithel. This decision would have to wait for now. With everything lined up the way Dacheldor had planned, he finally felt peace at the thought of fully letting go of his old life. The next day, his face was no longer visible. He had completely become a being of living shadow. The New Empire. Darkfire's new Limbo Empire began the conquest of Limbo in nearly the same way it had in every other timeline. In this timeline, Kara was not one of the generals, but a different ambitious immortal was in her place. Also, Den was not a member of this empire, but his son, Ned, was. Dacheldor, secretly spying on Darkfire and his brother Benji, was promoted to head general and led many assaults. The three became fast friends, eventually renaming the empire the Limbo Imperial Military, once they took over the entire realm. Dacheldor gifted Darkfire 2 rings of immortality, secretly refashioned by Bylon, and placed in the location of the originals. While this was going on, Darkstar had his sights set on expanding the power of the Realm Lords. He built multiple new Realm Lord training centers, each with their own headmasters. These centers were located in different realms, opening the possibility of working with the Realm Lords to many locations. New training methods honed over the past few million years allowed Realm Lord training without the need for the centralized Prime Realm. Still, the Prime Realm was the best central location for all Realm Lord special projects, so a Grand Citadel was created in the Prime Realm as a seat of authority over all Realm Lord training centers. This citadel was governed by the original headmasters. Eventually, the living weapons, mage lords, and deities decided they wanted representation in the Realm Lord Citadel, and equal rights to training their people in the locations of Realm Lord schools. Seeing this as a step right before a complete merger of the 4 groups, Darkstar brokered the agreement. Within the Citadel, a council of 8 would rule over all decisions relating to the allied forces. It consisted of 2 Realm Lords, 2 Mage Lords, 2 living weapons, and 2 deities. Darkstar was one of the 2 representatives of the Realm Lords. The other was a man whose body resembled a metallic orb. He was said to be the greatest Realm Lord ever trained, but no one could prove or disprove that. Vorn was one of the representatives of the Mage Lords. The other was a man named Starlos. Bylon was one of the representatives of the living weapons. The other was a giant dragon named Typhon, though Bylon nicknamed him Ruggy. The 2 beings representing the deities were named Ra and Uranus. In the event that all votes came to a tie, Dacheldor was elected to be the deciding vote. Darkstar did not rule this council outright, but the amount of influence he held over it was enough to get nearly anything he wanted passed. While Dacheldor, Darkfire, and Benji conquered Limbo, they had no idea of the massive spread of Darkstar's influence across the other realms. They drank to their victories and prepared for their lives as leaders of the Limbo Imperial Military. In that moment, all their dreams seemed attainable. Return of Prime. When Fireside fully absorbed and integrated all of Uzulkree's energy, he awoke again in the body of Prime. His location was a hidden vault in Limbo, and his body was invisible to all. He strode out of the vault, making his way to Castle Darkfire, with the intention of reuniting with Dacheldor. He was surprised to find he no longer had access to enter the castle unseen. He had to make himself visible to a few of the guardsmen and request an audience with Dacheldor. They gladly took him to the location of the head general, who reacted to seeing Prime with confusion. He did not recognize this living shadow in samurai armor that claimed to know him. Prime was equally confused. Dacheldor did not appear to be an Illithel, but was instead a disciple of some other Illithel. He inquired as to what happened, but Dacheldor did not understand anything he was saying. Through Dacheldor's eyes, Dacheldor saw Prime. He dropped what he was doing and opened a portal to a park in a world not far from the castle. After stepping through, he reached out in the universe and allowed his presence to be easily felt. Prime sensed the location of the Illithel connected to Dacheldor and excused himself from the castle. He traveled to a nearby world and landed in the park to behold Dacheldor. When he did, he could see through all of Dacheldor's illusions. He saw the being of living shadows before him. With the arm of Tezencrul, he recognized him for who he was.
"Look how far you've come."
Prime's multi-layered voice boomed with pride. He had not expected Dacheldor to find his way to Tezencrul and take on the arm without his help. He had also not expected his complete transformation so quickly.
"You are no longer an infant. You are a full Illithel."
Lexeldor's armor appeared around him, and he drew his two massive swords. The power of his left arm vibrated. Prime laughed. It appeared Lexeldor was planning to fight him. He casually asked him why. "To figure out which one of us is in charge now," Lexeldor said. "Who gets to select the next generation of Illithel?" Prime drew his two curved swords, finding this idea very interesting. The two ran at one another. As they struck, an explosion of force radiated out from them, filling the park with dust. When the dust cleared, Lexeldor had one of his swords buried halfway through Prime's body, and Prime had his swords thrust through Lexeldor's chest. Prime's soul was pulled partway into Lexeldor's arm, and Lexeldor's soul was pulled partway into Prime. They could kill each other in this instant, possibly the only moment where such beings could die. They realized their true strength, then released each other. Yanking their weapons out of each other, they healed and laughed to one another. "A tie," Lexeldor remarked. "I had thought one of us would win."
There is always a third option,
Prime said.
"It appears we are evenly matched, so we'll have to decide who becomes an Illithel together."
As they spoke, they each realized they knew the true intentions of each other. Something had happened when they nearly drained each other's souls. They were now connected in a strange bond. It was not like the bonds of the disciples. They did not know each other's thoughts. They simply knew each other's intentions and could pass mental messages to each other. They could see what each other was planning to some extent, through visions. Lexeldor explained to Prime what had happened while he was gone. He took him to see Bylon, the only being Lexeldor had turned into an Illithel so far. Bylon shook Prime's hand, happy to welcome him back, and the three made a pact to be the leaders of the new pantheon they were building. Prime marveled at how Lexeldor and Bylon had made and manipulated their clones. The two reminded him so much of himself that it further verified to him his plan had been the right one all along. He even mused how now that Lexeldor's children were disciples and Darkfire and Benji were in charge of Limbo, there was no need to keep from interfering in the lives of these clones. They had served their original purposes. Lexeldor and Bylon agreed. What they needed now, Prime explained, was a way to discover the most talented beings in the cosmos, beings with the potential to become Illithel. Prime had just the idea of how to do that.